Good evening. Welcome to our Savvy Chat tonight. I'm Jen Horinja from Savvy Cooperative, your host, and tonight we're in for a treat because we are shifting away from our core value series, which we just finished up, so please go back and check that out. But October is Co-op Month. Yes, that's a real thing, National Co-op Month. And so because we are a co-op, we are going to spend the month really talking about co-ops and what that means, and that's why tonight's going to be really awesome because we're going to just set the stage for that. I am joined tonight with Nathan Schneider from Colorado University Boulder. He is a professor there and also an author. He recently just published a book, Everything for Everyone, and has some other amazing books that will tell you all sorts of awesome things about co-ops and alternative models. And also Jason Wiener, who is our lawyer and does shared ownership and alternative finance, talks about social enterprises. So he's also an amazing authority on all these things. So I will let them kind of say hello and introduce themselves. Where are you guys calling in from tonight? Nathan, where are you at?
I'm at home in Colorado.
Amazing. And Jason, where are you?
Probably less than a dozen miles from Nathan, also in Colorado.
What do you know? What an odd coincidence.
Miles? Who says that? Well, awesome. I am in a different backdrop than usual. I am in my childhood home out in Massachusetts, outside of Boston. So welcome to colonial town out here. But yeah, so amazing, guys. I'm so excited to have you here and to kind of dive in to talk about co-ops. When I started off, you guys were two of the first people I reached out to when I just was trying to figure out what are co-ops and, is this the right sort of thing for us? So, I gave you guys a little brief intro. Before we kind of dive in, though, just, maybe kind of introduce yourselves a little bit more. So, Nathan, tell a little bit about maybe why you are interested in co-ops and a little bit more about what you do.
Well, I teach media studies at CU Boulder, and I'm particularly interested in how this cooperative tradition can help make the online economy more accountable and more democratic. So increasingly, we're seeing this platforms built on the internet shaping the future of our economy, shaping the future of work and the future of data and personal information and so much else. And over and over again, we see these accountability crises where these CEOs are brought before Congress, and it doesn't really make sense to slap them with tons of regulations. Often, it doesn't make sense to treat them the way that a lot of previous generations of companies have been treated. It's just a different set of challenges, and I think there are a lot of ways in which shared ownership and shared governance, which is the kind of core of this tradition of cooperative business, can help address these challenges in fundamental ways. And Savvy has been a leader in helping to shape this broader movement known as platform cooperativism that I've been involved in for a few years now. And Savvy is helping to craft the challenge of what it looks like to build a startup that aims to practice democracy from day one.
Well, thank you for those kind words. But yeah, you're really a leader and, again, somebody that I turn to really help kind of think through some of these things because we're doing something new. And of course, we would be nowhere without Jason, again, who is our lawyer. So Jason, why did you even get interested in what you're doing here?
So I wanted to be, and for a brief time after law school, was a labor lawyer, where I thought that my highest purpose would be to advocate for the disenfranchised, the workers who produce value in our economic system, but often were left behind when it came to the fruits of that labor. I became a little disenchanted myself with the adversarial and sometimes zero-sum nature of labor relations. In law school, I saw similar patterns in the environmental sector and in other in other sectors and approaches to business, and it felt like a broken system was just kind of on repeat, that in every kind of corner of the economy there was a business cycle and a mantra that had this fairly narrow view that maximizing shareholder return meant externalizing all other stakeholders and costs. And it just begat this vicious cycle of regulation and litigation and, this pendulum swinging back and forth. I had the good fortune in 2009, just after the economic collapse, the Great Recession, to become a worker owner and the general counsel at an employee-owned solar company here in Colorado. And I saw for the second time in my life what an alternative form of business looked like when you put control of the business in the hands of the workers. And it gave me hope that there was, in fact, a different way to do business through that experience and kind of learning and absorbing the history of the movement. I was kind of re-inspired that we're seeing kind of a renaissance of an age-old business form that served NGO sectors, philanthropic sectors. It served really every business and non-governmental sector that you can imagine. And we're just at the tip of the iceberg, but we're seeing a new generation of entrepreneurs and even seasoned entrepreneurs who are just sick and tired of the old system, looking at a new way of doing business. And I think the data is really coming in to show that this is a far more resilient, equitable, and potentially successful and even profitable way of doing business, whether it's in a for-profit sector or in the housing context, where outcomes are not measured on profit, but rather on social justice, inclusivity, and access.
That's awesome. Yeah. Well, we're going to dive more into kind of all of those thoughts and your background more with all of that. But, I think one of the things that we struggle with is even just describing what are co-ops, especially in the context of sort of this new way that we're talking about them. So for our listeners who are just tuning in, what is sort of that elevator pitch? How would you define a co-op just very simply to somebody? I'm kind of curious how both of you guys might do that. So Nathan, I'll start with you.
I tend to define it as a business that is owned and governed by the people who participate in it. And that's in contrast to a kind of business in which chiefly investors are the ones who own and govern, and then there are people who work on behalf of those investors. Now, this doesn't tend to include, a kind of family business and small businesses that often do actually benefit from being part of larger cooperatives. But here I'm talking about businesses in which there's broad-based shared ownership. Where a whole class of people who are participants are also owners.
That's awesome. Yeah. And Jason, what would your kind of take on it be?
Well, I think of the definition kind of in two spheres. On the one hand, there's kind of the vernacular, the cooperative as both a business model and just an organizing model. As I said, it's both a form of business, for-profit business, as well as an organizing model for any group of individuals with a shared purpose or shared need. It's a business structure that is meant to solve problems where we aggregate both scale and need to provide access. And the beneficiaries of that model are the same ones who either produce or consume the chief value of the cooperative. So wherever there's kind of a fulcrum of shared interest, it's a circular model that has those same beneficiaries producing or consuming the value in a regenerative system. On the legal side, the definition needs to contemplate the source of law. And in the cooperative space, or in the domain of cooperative law, it's like any business form. So it's the domain of state law. We don't have federal corporate law in America. We have federal regulation that applies both to co-ops and non-co-ops, such as tax, securities, employment, labor, some other regimes, but the product is defined by state statutes. And just about every state in the country here in the US has at least one cooperative statute. There are many states that have 3 or 4. I'd venture to guess there are upwards of 150 different cooperative statutes. And what's different about cooperative law and the definitions within them versus, say, corporate law or the law of LLCs is that we don't have a model statute. We have patchwork of statutes all around the country, and that has its pros and cons, but it has a legal definition within each of those statutes that more or less look fairly similar.
And it's also important to recognize that it's a global movement. Yes. Often the definition people turn to first is the the 7 principles of the International Cooperative Alliance. And that's a set of principles that have been agreed upon by cooperative businesses all over the world. And so, sometimes when people, in the US context, want to kind of change the definition to meet a certain particular short-term interest, I think it's important to step back and recognize, hey, this is something that, people around the world are doing. And I think it's really kind of a privilege to be able to work with this broad movement of solidarity.
And that's great. And, I was hoping that somebody would bring up the cooperative principles. Either of you want to quickly run through just what they are, list them off? You know my heart.
Testing memory here.
I have.
One is democratic control, which is the idea that governance is shared democratically, generally on a one-person, one-vote basis between the members of the cooperative. Another one, economic participation. This is the idea that the cooperative is a collaboration of individuals who participate actively, continuously, on an economic basis, that it's not just, it's a self-help organization, but it's derived around economic transactions. I like to call these kind of values-laden economic arrangements, meaning that they're economic in nature, they're sometimes dollars and cents changing hands, but those transactions are nested within these broader philosophical pillars and principles that Nathan referred to. Those are the two of my favorite.
And then, the first one is open membership. And one thing that's been really interesting to me is to see how this one has changed. I think early on, a big part of the meaning of that was non-discrimination according to religious affiliation. This came out of 1840s Britain, and that was the concern. People, it was very high-minded to say you couldn't discriminate against Quakers or something like that. Today, that I think has taken on a different meaning, where a lot of the young people doing it today are seeing that as a call to radical inclusion, to building cooperatives that are more accessible and inclusive than a lot of other businesses around them. One other that I'd point to too is Principle 5, which is education. And that's what we're doing right now. This is and this was part of that original list from the 1840s. The idea that cooperatives, part of what makes them powerful and what makes them work is when they're always spaces of mutual education, that members are always learning from each other and helping to gain the knowledge and capacity to help govern themselves.
Yeah, and we're doing it, guys. I think one of the ones that struck me, especially when I was first getting into the co-op space, was number 7, cooperation among co-ops, or I guess it's number 6. And to me, I used to joke.
Yeah, good luck with that.
Yeah. But people were amazing when I entered into the space, and you all included. And I used to joke with people that I was starting to educate about co-ops, that that it's like co-op fight club, that the rule is that you have to cooperate with other co-ops. And
it sometimes happens.
Well, hey, we're still living the dream. But yeah, I think, all of this is great to kind of help get people sort of within the frame of mind of what it means to be a co-op and why we're using those things. But, we're using it in sort of the modern day sense, and we're going to go into that. But Nathan, you've become an expert on how co-ops have been really evolving over time. So kind of what are some of the early examples that sort of have excited you and that you've seen during your sort of study of co-ops?
Well, one thing that's just been so striking is realizing how much this model has shaped our world. And increasingly, I just look around me and see these things everywhere. I was just up visiting some relatives up in northern Colorado who are farmers, and they're growing beets, which is what our family came here to do in the early 20th century. They're still doing it, and they still bring their beets to a beet processing cooperative. And then, all over there are these big tanks that say Agfinity on it. It's a big ag co-op in our state. And it just a reminder of how the American agriculture in particular has been really powerfully shaped by this model, as farmers in the late 19th century, early 20th century organized together to challenge the power of urban corporations. And then, you look at the hardware store down the road from me is only able to compete with Home Depot down the road from it because it is a member of a large purchasing cooperative, Ace Hardware. The coffee shop next to it is only able to provide fair trade coffee because of the coffee cooperatives that have been formed around the equatorial world that enable farmers to have kind of leverage in those global markets. And all around, all of these businesses are taking Visa cards, and that problem of cross interbank payment was solved by the development of cooperatives. Visa, for instance, was a cooperative when it was first formed. And then
what you're saying is so interesting, though, that like I didn't know any of those things were co-ops. Like
absolutely.
Hardware or Visa, or I guess I knew REI was, but like Associated Press, all these things that have come into our lives that we interact with all the time, but yet most of us, I would, wager to say, had no idea that they were co-ops.
Yeah, and there are these histories that are just completely unsung. One person I just wanted to mention in light of Savvy is Michael Shadid, who's in the Cooperative Hall of Fame for anybody who cares about the Cooperative Hall of Fame. But in the years before World War II, he was a Lebanese doctor who lived in Oklahoma, and he attempted to form a farmer-owned cooperative hospital. And the idea just being like, hey, people benefiting from services should, ultimately be in charge of them in some way. And the American Medical Association, after seeing this, went around the country and preemptively banned this model everywhere they went. And so it just shows how a lot of the history of cooperatives is also full of that kind of repression, where this model has been resisted and suppressed. And that's part of the reason that we often don't know about it, even when it's operating all around us.
Yeah, I think that's great. And so, you've also been working with some of these other, what we are, a platform co-op. Can you give some examples of those?
Yeah, so one of the first, for instance, that I think has a lot of interesting similarities with Savvy is called Stocksy United, and it's based in Canada, but has members in dozens of countries around the world, and it's a stock photo platform where gig workers doing photography are the owners of the company, and it's become a really powerful model in its market. It's been able to attract some of the best photographers because it really is centering the needs of photographers. Another example in Europe is called Smart, and it's a freelancer cooperative enabling people who are doing freelance gigs to have easier access to accounting tools and regular payment and making sure they get paid on time. So this model really has a lot of power for helping to solve some of the pain points of a distributed web of independent people who might otherwise be really isolated in their markets and in their sectors, and enabling them to come together and bargain collectively.
Yeah, and I think, I have to admit all of my co-op ignorance coming into this, but like I didn't know what a purchasing co-op was. That people band together to be able to get competitive pricing, to keep up with the Walmarts or the Home Depots or the whatever. So I think that's a different kind of co-op than we are. So Jason, can you kind of help break down what those different types of co-ops and how you're seeing them in modern day as an attorney working in this space with all these different companies? Help us kind of understand what's out there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there are probably 5 flavors of cooperatives.
That's a lot.
And there may be, and there's some kind of edge cases that may fall somewhere in between. Of course, there's some crossover. We have, within the traditional sector of cooperation, we have financial cooperatives, credit unions. We have agriculture cooperatives, which are themselves potentially 2 different categories. There's marketing cooperatives, which are brands that market the kind of raw product of the farmer. So Ocean Spray is a marketing cooperative. The farmers are all independent cranberry bog owners, and they produce value add product through a marketing and distribution brand, the cooperative. Sunkist is another example. Diamond, the nut grower and purveyor of nut milks and raw nuts in California, is a cooperative. One of the big, I think it's either Florida Natural or one of the big orange juice companies in Florida is also a marketing cooperative. Others are distribution cooperatives, where the cooperative is still it's in the agricultural domain, but its function is to process and distribute the raw product. So I think the differentiator there is where in the value chain the cooperative is adding value to the farmers themselves. The third of the traditional is the energy sector. So more than half of Americans receive their electricity, their pole electricity to their home from an electric association or an electric cooperative, which is owned by the ratepayers. Many of those cooperatives purchase wholesale power from generation and transmission cooperatives. Here in Colorado, for instance, we have 43 independent retail cooperatives that banded together to form a federated cooperative that produces the power for the whole 43 co-op network across 3 different states, hence tri-state. We have non-traditional co-ops, which are where more of the interesting flavors fall. We have worker-owned cooperatives, which are generally cooperatives that are owned by, for, and of laborers, whether those are employees or contractors or gig workers. Savvy, for instance, has a class or 2 within that category. We have purchasing cooperatives, which are often unsung because they tend to be business to business, and we don't often see them at the consumer level. This is where you'd see, Ace Hardware or group purchasing like Carpet One, or Best Western even is a purchasing co-op of independently owned franchisee hotel owners.
That
one could be a marketing. Yeah. That one could be a marketing co-op as well. It's a little bit of both. And then I'm probably leaving some out. And the last one is really where we've done the most work in the last 5 years, and it's the multi-stakeholder cooperative. This is it's a hybrid of all of the others, where it's essentially just an amalgam of a multi-constituency co-op that has sometimes workers, sometimes consumers, sometimes producers. And the reason for the amalgamation is to create a marketplace for value exchange that could not exist in a traditional business model or couldn't exist in a traditional marketplace. No market economics would support those transactions. And I think that's what Savvy has done, is it's brought a market, a functional market, to a space where there was no service provided and there was no value assigned to some of the transactions. Social media is another good example where at present, most platforms will extract data from witting and unwitting consumers, and the platform will take that data, process and aggregate and sell it off, and we don't see a dime of it. And we're starting to see the development of brokerage services and an economy for that data. And so, as it turns out, there are multi-stakeholder cooperatives forming to tackle the question of data ownership, user centricity, privacy protection, and very many of those are also kind of hybrids of consumer ownership, producer ownership, worker ownership, et cetera, et cetera.
And I think that's really great to list off all those things and to understand what is and what's not a co-op, because there are lots of different types of co-ops. But I know Nathan is a great co-op police to make sure that people are using them correctly, and that we're honoring those who are choosing the co-op route. So we have had to deal with this on educating people about the difference between Savvy as a co-op and other sort of membership organizations. And I think that that's something that, because the co-op might be new to people, that they don't necessarily understand how it's different. So either of you want to take a stab at kind of explaining how this is different than, having a club card and getting some points and kickbacks? Like, how is that any different than a co-op, or is it?
Yeah, I've made some of my best friends policing the boundaries. But one thing is to note is that actually in a lot of cases, these models were developed by co-ops and then adapted by non-co-ops when they recognized that it worked. These membership models and so forth. Even crowdfunding. The old way to do crowdfunding. When a bunch of people wanted, like for instance, REI was founded by a bunch of people in Seattle. Led largely by a woman who recently died quite elderly. So everyone was saying, start a co-op and you'll live to be 100. And they wanted this really nice ice axe from Germany, and they couldn't just buy one at a time. So they crowdfunded it. But the way to do it at that time was form a co-op. And the difference is that as opposed to crowdfunding today, where you just kind of have to cross your fingers and hope the people you gave money to are going to come through, that was crowdfunding with real ownership and accountability built in.
Yeah. So, I think one of the other things that Jason, you alluded to about how, how are we using data on these platforms, which is something that we're sensitive to. And maybe 2 weeks ago, we heard that Airbnb was talking about giving shares to hosts. So what is that like? And is that then a co-op?
No. A co-op, as I said at the outset, it's the adoption of certain fairly flexible principles, but there is a decisive moment to embed those principles in the ownership structure. That's missing from Airbnb. There's core values, they have a mission, a purpose statement, but that's fairly fuzzy and malleable. A co-op has these principles embedded, often from the statute, meaning that they are, inherited forms of DNA. The second thing is a co-op is in some ways all or nothing. You can't share one member, one vote governance with shareholders. You either have democratic control or you don't. So in some ways, control really hinges at the 50% line. And companies for decades, centuries, have been giving equity to both employees and stakeholders who they want to incentivize to be loyal and produce. And they've done that anywhere from, de minimis percentages here or there, all the way up to even significant stakes. I would argue that unless the stakeholders own a controlling interest, they can either elect the board, which controls management and every other major function of the corporation, or they have primary economic benefit. And in some cases, that even isn't enough to constitute a cooperative. We're not talking about a cooperative. And what Airbnb is really talking about is this kind of version 2.0 to the sharing economy. One of the best things to happen out of the Great Recession was this moniker, the sharing economy, that popularized the notion that with technology-enabled peer-to-peer connection, we could share access to assets without needing to clutter our streets with more cars or develop McMansions in every neighborhood. And what was missing from all of those was any notion that the users of those platforms should have any control over the nature of their relationship to one another. And what that allowed was for an awakening to the notion that ownership is both deep and meaningful, and it revolves around three core pieces or elements. One is governance, the notion that the stakeholders control. They don't just have the right to vote a director, they control the organization. They have an economic benefit deriving from their use of the platform. And three is they have the information and education and resources with which to make meaningful decisions and be meaningfully engaged. I would argue that from what I know of the Airbnb proposal, one, it's not currently legal under existing securities law. Two, they're probably somewhere along the Etsy lines talking about 10 or 15% ownership and when they go public, but nothing before then.
Interesting.
And it does point to something that I think could be a possibility, where companies like Savvy could set the bar higher and create a kind of competitive market for ownership, in a sense, right? And you could end up with a scenario where we see more and more companies like Airbnb. Uber has looked at this. Jason has mentioned Etsy. There's another on-demand platform called Managed by Q that does office cleaning that did this. And they're, in each case, they're recognizing, hey, there's something in it even for an investor-backed company to do shared ownership. And I would love to see this just amplify and see these companies kind of bending over backwards to give their stakeholders more and more kind of ownership and governance earlier in the course of their company. And that's part of the power of the success of something like savvy is it can set that bar higher, increase users' expectations of what they should be getting out of a platform, and that could really transform the so-called sharing economy into a real sharing economy.
Yeah,
and within that,
oh, go ahead,
the
Jason.
cooperative is still only one family within a broader ecosystem. There's a rich biodiversity of ownership, and I think Nathan's right. We're on the cusp, if not already in, kind of this ownership revolution, really rethinking what ownership is, what it means, how it's expressed, and cooperatives are kind of this growing piece of the pie, but there's a rich diversity of options out there that are legitimate forms of shared ownership, but may not have all the attributes of a cooperative. And I think we need to recognize that we're in the midst of this fundamental reevaluation of what it means to be an owner, both civically as well as politically, economically, culturally. And I think I think Nathan's right. We shouldn't necessarily judge one version over another. I think this is part of kind of the open, kind of exchange of ideas. I think there are different uses in different marketplaces, different sectors, but it's an exciting time to be kind of having those conversations and seeing what works.
Yeah, and I think you guys make me think of the fact that people think that I am this blockchain and crypto expert because we're part of the co-op ecosystem. I mean, I got another email today asking me, as one of the 200 crypto experts, to give an interview. I'm like, wow, if that's horrifying, then if I am one of the experts, and I've been asked to speak at ICO conferences, so it makes me feel like the blockchain crypto space likes to identify with co-ops, but yet, although there could be valuable forms of that, but that's still not exactly the same as what we're talking about here. So, I'm curious about, as we kind of think and use our sort of magic wand to look into the future of what could this be, I'm curious, if you guys have some sort of final thoughts on what you think sort of the vision and the future is, and whether or not co-ops can be part of helping to get us there.
I think, I'm really becoming allergic to this idea of disruption. I think that there's a creative destruction in every cycle and every, parallel to the kind of biosphere. But I think we need to reserve judgment that a co-op is the right solution in every instance. And we need to think carefully about what makes it not just viable from a legal standpoint, but really practical from an organizing and engagement standpoint. Because what I'm seeing is that there is this pendulum swinging from those that have been through venture capital backed startups and have ended up kind of riding that golden parachute down to the ground to start something new and wanting to do that as a cooperative, when you can spend all this time and energy building something robust and elegant and complex to solve a need, but the cooperative may not necessarily be that ideal starting point. It may not even be the right midpoint. But what I'm excited about is all of this rich young growth coming from the forest floor, this reawakening from the Great Recession, both from a new generation of entrepreneurs, from folks with the business experience. We're seeing so many convergences that we're really, I think, we're at the dawn of this new understanding of the power of business, sustainable business, ethical business, and it's going to take lots and lots of different shapes. But I think we're starting to see the facade of the traditional economy, crack enough that there are now entry points for these co-ops to scale and grow and do really interesting things, but also for us to reimagine existing relationships we have in our economy and the ways in which we're already interacting with cooperatives, or the way in which, as Nathan said, many of our traditions are shaped by cooperative business. I think it's just really exciting. I'm very, very optimistic.
Well, I think you would be. You work in this space and you see it in and out, so that's a great sort of perspective. Nathan?
Well, one thing that really struck me, especially toward the end of working on this book, was how broad this tradition is. And, coming out to Colorado, learning, for instance, that, my grandfather had been involved in cooperatives, who was like exactly the opposite of the people who had gotten me into this in the first place, who were these, Occupy Wall Street activists in 2012. And that recognition to me has been really hopeful in this moment of incredible polarization. Expanding employee ownership, for instance, is one thing that was on both the Republican and Democratic platforms in 2016. And so, in this moment where we seem to have nothing in common across the society, where faith seems to be declining in democracy as a way of achieving things in various contexts, this tradition offers an opportunity to both recognize common ground that is really much more widespread than we might notice, and also an opportunity to not just reinforce and emphasize and restore democratic institutions, which is often the discourse, and I think is a really kind of pathetic discourse in a way, but is actually this tradition of cooperative business is an opportunity to deepen and expand and strengthen and advance the tradition of democracy into new spaces, into parts of our lives where it hasn't existed before. And I think that's really the only way we're going to recover the belief in our own capacity for self-governance. If we're not just restoring something that might have worked 100 years ago, but we're advancing into something that will work for our future.
Yeah, well, I think, a lot of that's great, as we're thinking about what can this be, and keep kind of our eye on the prize and have these great visions for the future, but also kind of circling back to give our listeners some practical advice on sort of the actionable steps they can take tomorrow as they go back to their daily lives, because of course, some of those things are going to take a really long time. So kind of thinking about that, what can people do as they sort of make their decisions about, what they do in their day-to-day lives? So there are things that you think that you could give them some advice on how to take what we've talked about tonight and apply it to their lives?
Well, one thing I'd encourage is recognize that as members of Savvy, if you are a member, if you're not a member, join immediately. But and then once you are, you're part of a broader movement of platform cooperativism. And I really encourage you, for instance, to go to ioo.coop. That's internetofownership.coop. And you can you can see a directory of platform co-ops all over the world. You can go to a connect page that points out email lists and other points of access where you can connect with the broader community. And we'd really love to have more Savvy members as part of that, helping to shape the conversation about this movement. And then also, if you're in the United States, one organization that I really recommend that represents a lot of the kind of new edge of the co-op movement is the New Economy Coalition, and a fantastic organization that sees cooperative economics at the intersection of racial justice and climate justice and a bunch of other kind of urgent concerns that many people in this movement have. Awesome.
Jason, any sort of parting thoughts there?
Yeah, I think connecting the online and offline cooperative tradition is important, as is furthering Principle 6. I think just taking stock in each of our lives, the way in which we already are members in other co-ops or can become. I think of something as mundane as paying your utility bill, whether that's cable, internet, electric, gas, and really looking to see and ask the question. Ownership really matters. Ask the question: how are these daily necessities? How are these assets owned? I'm the beneficiary of the availability of these assets. How are they owned? Are there cooperative alternatives? Credit unions matter. Join one, join the board, connect that co-op with Savvy. There are opportunities that we can only and can't in some cases imagine that arise from the idea that we share in this tradition. And I think all too often the cooperative sector is splintered because we see the business that we're in first and less the common ownership attributes. But it's a way for us to engage productively and civically with one another at a time when our politics is completely dysfunctional, and in many ways, our social media lives are totally homogenized. And so this is really, I think, a way of bridging the online and offline our lives in a way that's really enriching and deeply rooted in our own communities.
I love that, and that kind of brings us nicely into our sort of rapid fire questions that we ask all of our guests. Is, and I want to hear from both of you that let's humanize this a little bit more. That we're not just people on social platforms, and we all have things that are going on outside of like how much we're helping people. So, what do you guys do when you're not being savvy or helping others?
I take my kid to the local airport and watch airplanes take off.
Excellent. Jason, what do you do?
Very similar. I take my kid to our CSA, where
that's pretty cooperative there. I don't know.
Yeah.
You stay in your lane.
Try to live and model our values for our kid, soon to be 2, and
soon to be 3, dude.
I mean, he's not to be 2 kids. He's soon to be 3. That's right.
Both of our guests here are expecting babies at any moment, literally. So, congratulations in advance to you both. All right. Well, how about what's something quirky that people might not know about you? I've loved asking this question. It's fun to find these things out.
Quirky.
I don't know about quirky, but dark and kind of awkward for me is I have a kind of gun fixation.
That's right.
I did not know that.
Found that out. Jason, what's yours?
Well, you just inspired me. I have a knife fixation. I had throwing knives as a kid, and I collected knives from all over the world. My favorite one was a Nepalese, I think it was called a Gurkha, kind of a bow-mounted knife.
Fascinating. See, look what I'm learning. I wish I could share. I have a nunchuck. Sadly,
start one.
I can't. I just do a mean roundhouse when I need to. All right. Now, we oftentimes have people from healthcare on here, but even beyond, I think healthcare does sort of bond us all together. So also asking you guys, what do you think is one of sort of the biggest healthcare headaches that you guys see that we have to address?
Billing, bar none.
Yep.
It is insane to me that as I have a bill sitting here from a visit for a doctor's appointment for my toddler, but just to see the sheer number of different statements and bills that I get, none of this could be standardized. I mean, how could this not be all funneled into a central patient portal that has all billing statements feed into one patient portal? I pay in one place, and all the medical data and billing goes into one experience. I have logins for 12 different, and he's a healthy kid. It's insane.
Yeah, welcome to the world of chronic illness, where we have thousands of them. So I agree. Nathan, any thoughts on that?
Oh, yeah, I mean, that's the same type of thing. It's just astonishing to me that, when our first kid was born, my wife was on the phone during labor with the insurance company trying to ensure that we really could go to an evidence-supported, much more affordable birth center option rather than going to the hospital, and it was really quite sickening.
Wow.
And it's just the absurdities are everywhere.
Well, then also a great lead into my last question, which I love, my favorite one to ask about. What song title did you guys come up with that you think best describes the current state of healthcare? I do give people a heads up about this question, but I always hear the answers here live. So what'd you guys pick?
I picked, I don't know of a specific song. I should have picked a song, but anything from the soundtrack of Blade Runner, I think captures the kind of pathos that people experience of operating with a kind of quasi-human at best system that is increasingly running our lives.
Excellent. We'll have to pick out one because I can't put the entire Blade Runner soundtrack on our Spotify playlist.
The first one should be fine.
Okay, perfect. What do you have, Jason?
So I approach the question, best describes the current state of either the economy or business. And mine's really kind of corny, but it's Here Comes the Sun by the Beatles for three reasons. One is, I think we're still kind of awakening from the winter of the Great Recession. And I think we're starting to see some really interesting and verdant life emerge from the snow. The second is, I think within the rich biodiversity of the cooperative sector, we're seeing some really exciting new growth on the forest floor. And then I think the third is just the idea of kind of regeneration, that we're starting to see old traditional co-ops really begin to take stock in the new tradition. And I hope that the sunshine will kind of, will create the conditions for that regeneration to be long-lasting and durable.
I couldn't have put it more beautifully. I mean, you took us so poetically into the end of our chat here. So, before we end, I want to just put this back to you both, because you've been amazing to share all these things with us and our Savvy members and other listeners. I want to help make sure that we can amplify what you're doing, because that's what co-ops do. So anything that you guys are working on that you want to plug and share with our listeners, I would love to be able to share that. Nathan, you've got a new book that we've been so excited about, Everything for Everyone. Anything else that you want to share about that, or anything else you're working on?
No, just the book.
Everybody get the book. It's amazing. It's a full history of co-ops and looking at it in the past, present, and future, and a great sort of way of kind of summarizing even what this chat's about. Jason, how about you? Anything that you want to share that you're working on?
Definitely read the book. First and foremost, I think it's really one of the most definitive, all-encompassing kind of, it acculturates you to the tradition. And I think it does so in a way that's not intimidating or judgmental. It really is an invitation to think creatively. My plug is really to begin to look around our daily lives and think about opportunities for greater collaboration, opportunities for improving on existing collaboration if you're a member of a food co-op. And I think it's really just exciting and energizing people to become more engaged and active in this tradition and in the form of association that has us share our interests toward outcomes and social objectives. My plug is really just to be more generally to activate us and celebrate one another, give thanks, and support one another. I think this movement is still pretty fragile. The reemergence movement is still pretty fragile, and I think it needs more and more dedicated people to give their thoughts and their energy and their time to, and it's worth it.
I just love listening to Jason talk. It makes me feel so inspired myself. And I think that's really important for all of us too, that are in this day in and day out, to remember that in all sorts of ways, big and small, we can continue to help sort of drive this movement and change forward. So I thank you guys so much for joining us tonight. I think, seeing the comments from those who are listening in, people got a lot out of it. I got a lot out of it, even just learning new things about co-ops. So I can tell that this is going to be a great series for our members and beyond to really get more into the heart of what co-ops are. So before we sign off, I want to invite all of our listeners to join us next week. We're going to continue chatting about co-ops. We're going to be talking with Greg Brodsky, who is the founder of Start.coop, which is a new accelerator to help young co-ops, and Savvy is one of them, to become, what they are and reach their potential and really at scale. And it's going to be a really interesting conversation to talk about what does it take to build co-ops in this sort of new economy. So please join us for that. It's going to be great to kind of piggyback off of this discussion. And all of us in the co-op space tend to know each other. So I know that you guys know Greg very well as well. So I thank you guys for taking time on your Sunday nights right before your children are born. It's really great for you to take that time. That shows your dedication. So thank you guys. I'll let you say goodbye before we sign off.
Bye. Thank you, Jen.
Oh, it's
Yeah, thanks, Jen, for putting this on.
Of course. All right. Thanks, everybody, and we'll catch you next week. Till then, stay savvy.